got it. And it's great to be able to talk with people about this play. It's been a several-year journey, but we're really excited to premiere it in New York. And I'll let Carolyn talk a little bit. Well, I think we're going to go back and forth, right?
Right. And what Cindy meant to say was premiere it in Minnesota.
Sorry.
Which is where we are. Cindy's in New York. She's coming here. So I'm Carolyn Levy, and I'm going to start out by telling you a little bit about the play and what it's about. It's called I Was a Stranger Too, and it is about asylum seekers and the people who help them here in Minnesota, and in particular, the Jewish response to this enormous crisis. The central character is Rory, who's a woman whose mother escaped from Germany in the Kindertransport. And Rory is very aware that her mother survived because she was helped by strangers. And she is committed to the idea of giving back by helping people who are in dire straits today. And she's searching for a way to do that. The play presents 9 characters, asylum seekers and asylum helpers. They include, besides Rory, there's Polina, who is a gay woman from Russia who was attacked outside a gay club and then escapes with the help of an LGBTQ network. Chana is a trainer who works with people who are going to be accompanying people to court. Gabriella is an attorney. She's originally from India, but has lived here most of her life. And she travels back and forth between here and the Mexican border in order to work with people there and help them in their travels to America and in their claims for asylum. Jocelyn is the manager of a place called Sebastian House, which is a transitional home for asylum seekers. Luciana is from Colombia, and she found corruption on her job and attempted to be a whistleblower and then was threatened, and her family was threatened, so she took her daughter and escaped. Elias came here from Syria, went to Syria from Turkey, and his family came to Turkey long before. And he owned a little cafe and got in trouble with the police by standing up for someone who they were criticizing for his political views. Bo is a Hmong woman who came here at a very young age with her family during a time of great Hmong immigration, and at a time when the United States was welcoming Hmong people, particularly those who had helped the US government during the war in Vietnam. And she now works with the Hmong community. And Shireen, who is from the francophone from Cameroon, who escaped because she and her family had protested in support of the Anglophones, and her husband was disappeared, and the handwriting was on the wall, so she got out and flew to Ecuador, and then basically walked over time to America. So these 9 people tell their stories through monologues, and then ultimately interact at the end at the Sebastian House. And the play really presents the idea that hope can emerge from one single act of caring and concern. And the goal is to show you that and hope that you will think about doing something. I'm going to turn it over to Cindy.
Great, thank you. So I think one thing to say is that the play was based on interviews, and we initially had a grant from Ramon to do lots and lots of interviews, most of which were in Minnesota, but some outside Minnesota as well. But And so we interviewed people who were seeking asylum and people who were in organizations and people who were helping. And my interest, I approached Carolyn initially about this idea, and my interest in it came from a couple of different places. One is I was obviously the news, and everybody we talked to, this was 4 years ago, was kind of concerned about children being put into separate, basically detention or facilities at the southern border without their parents. And that, so that was a primary concern at the time. But I had been doing work for HIAS, which, as many people know, it's one of the 8 large refugee organizations in the country and in the world. And it's the one with the Jewish focus. So there's a Lutheran organization, there's Catholic organization, there's some that are non-denominational. But HIAS works around the world. I think has offices on every continent. I forget the number of countries, as well as in the US, and helps people resettle, does training, tries to secure people's safety. And I was then confronted with the numbers of people who are now seeking refuge around the world. And it's the highest since World War II, and maybe even before that, because that's around when the statistics are starting to be collected. And this relates to a number of different issues, war, internal conflicts, and repression of certain groups, whether that's religious minorities or gay and lesbian minorities. And also climate change is affecting this. So right now there are, and then since we started writing the play, new crises developed. So people keep saying, "Oh, you're so current," but actually the crises just keep flowing, and that's the projections for the future. So there was the Syrian crisis, and probably the most refugees in the world now are from Syria. And then there was the Afghan crisis, where people were fleeing from Afghanistan, and now, of course, Ukraine is adding to that burden. So countries around the world are accepting people who are fleeing. And the definitions, I think, are important here. So an immigrant is someone who is moving from country to country. Sometimes it's for family reasons, sometimes it's for economic reasons, or just for a change of perspective. And many of our families were immigrants. On my grandmother's side, they were immigrants. They left conditions in Germany after, in the mid 1800s, after there were a lot of anti-Semitic laws that were passed in Bavaria. So they were not entirely, they had reasons to leave, but they were not fleeing the kind of persecution that other groups have. So a refugee and immigrant, asylum seeker are fleeing persecution and a well-founded fear of death or other forms of repression like torture. And the difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker is a refugee goes to a camp, goes to another country, and is generally placed in a camp or is somehow watched in that country, and they apply to come to a place like the United States or Germany and go through a several-year vetting process. An asylum seeker is someone who lands in a country and asks to stay there and asks for safety because they will be facing persecution if they go home. And so I think that the important thing to understand about them, asylum seekers and refugees, is they're not necessarily people who want to leave their countries. They're facing upheaval and they're having to flee. And sometimes I like to ask people, what would you pack if you had to leave in a half an hour or an hour or a day. And so there are people who just took what they could. They are carrying most of what they own on their backs. And, we heard some incredible stories along the way. And I think I'll say one more thing and then turn it back to Carolyn. We're doing this 5 minutes back and forth. But my grandfather was a refugee in Minnesota. He was wheeled out of Russia in a wheelbarrow, and that was in the late 1800s. And it came with a draft notice, just like the men in Russia are getting now today. Those are selected populations. They're not every eligible person. They're people who are being targeted. But the Jewish population in Russia was targeted at that time. And they basically had a saying: you went into the army, but you didn't come out, because they were used as on the front line. They were used as fodder. So my grandfather's family, every male left as they became of draft age. And my grandfather was no different. And he landed in Minnesota and started out as a peddler, and eventually owned a little store in a town in western Minnesota called Dawson. And somebody wrote an article not long ago about the only Jewish family in Dawson ever, and that was my grandfather and my mother as well.
Okay. So as Cindy said, she contacted me and tempted me with this idea. And I had recently, prior to that, directed a play with my students at Hamlin called Crocodile Seeking Refuge, which is about, it takes place in Britain, and it's about an asylum seeker there. And so I had learned a lot about this process because it was so similar to how this worked in America. And very sad part of the play is this guy is sent back at the end because he fled without any papers, without any hospital records, without any proof of the abuse that he was claiming. And by the time of his hearing, he looked fine. You couldn't really tell that he had been tortured. And so it was already in my head. And I too, not very many generations away from immigrants. My parents were both born in this country, but my grandparents came over. My mother's family from Hungary and my father's family from Alsace-Lorraine. And they came in the 1880s, again, fleeing, either being conscripted into the army or pretty terrible pogroms and persecution. I worked with Cindy after we got this Ramon grant on doing interviews, and we spoke to so many people here, and then she spoke to many people elsewhere. And the grant was 4 years ago, and Cindy began to develop a script, and which actually looks a little different than the script we're doing now. But we were in rehearsal to present a portion of it at an evening of short works, and it was to open in March of 2020. And everything was closed down. Literally, I was on my way to one of the last rehearsals when they called me and said, we have to postpone. And of course, postpone became cancel, and it never happened. So Cindy took the opportunity presented by the pandemic, and most of us didn't find too many opportunities, but she took that opportunity to do a tremendous amount of rewriting. And we talked and went back and forth and read different pieces of it, and got some actors to help us read some of it. And then we did 2 presentations. One through the Jewish Play Project, we did an audio portion of some segments of the play. As I said, it's monologues, and I think there were about 6 that Cindy then did a abbreviated version of that for the audio. And then the Remember the Women Institute in New York helped us to do a Zoom presentation, also not the whole play. And we got very good responses from people. And as Irit said, Cindy, has won awards in the past, but also this play was a finalist in some competitions, and the play was being very well received. So we really wanted, more than anything, to put it on its feet and get it out there in front of an audience. And so we applied to Ramon for another grant. And 4 years later, you're allowed to do that. And so they gave us a second grant to, at that time, we thought maybe just do a reading of the play, of the whole play. And what we wanted more than anything was to actually get it up on its feet and do it. And so we sent out some fundraising letters, and people responded with contributions. And we were able to raise enough money to know that we could produce it. And we were very committed to the idea of paying the actors. And that was a primary focus. A friend of mine who used to be on the board of the neighborhood house connected me with the neighborhood house and said, oh, you should ask them if they'll give you some kind of deal. And they gave me a deal. They are contributing the space for no cost because what we're doing fits so well in their mission. So that took a huge chunk out of our budget, and we knew we could go ahead with the project. Okay, I'm going to turn it back to Cindy.
Great. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about the Jewish response to the refugee crisis. Well, it is a refugee crisis around the world. And let's just say the system here, as in many countries, but not all countries, is a mess. So, the question becomes, how do you operate when the society around you or the rules around you are chaotic and arbitrary in some cases and subject to whims and changes. So, but the Jewish response is, that we have always been, from the Exodus on, that we have always been a migratory people, and that we have had to flee many circumstances. And, World War II in Germany and Poland and other countries being the worst example, but throughout the history of the Jewish people, they have been had to migrate from country to country and find new places to live. So I'm not one to quote the Bible, but I can quote Mark Hetfield, who's the executive director of HIAS, which originally was called the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. And he points out that the Torah says 36 times the commandment to love the stranger as ourselves. And the one quote in Leviticus says, when a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not wrong him. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as one of your citizens. You shall love him as yourself, for we were strangers in the land of Egypt. So that kind of commandment, which I think is also an ethos of trying to make other people feel comfortable in a society, knowing how difficult it is to have to move and to resettle. And that's the history of the Jewish people. So that was something that I wanted to bring into the play. And that's what comes through Rory, the character whose family is around only because her mother was saved as a kinder transport from Germany during World War II. And so I have a little PowerPoint that I wanted to show. I think the other thing to say is that HIAS and did a transition because there are not so many people, Jewish people, fleeing now as in our history. There are some from Ukraine and some of those countries, but they resettled pretty much everybody Jewish in the United States and maybe Australia and a few other countries came through HIAS. So if you were to get their record, you would probably find your family there one way or another. But since the Soviet, the Jewish migration from the Soviet Union, that's probably been the last big group that has had to flee. And after that, Hayes moved from just helping Jewish people to using the values of Judaism to help people around the world. And, from every continent. I think I might have a minute. I have this little PowerPoint that I put together for some people in England. And I have a share screen here. Can you see it? Okay. So this is kind of, artists have, I think, always have had some of the strongest responses to, because we can tell stories. And to look at the statistics and the systems is pretty damaging. I mean, just draining. So, but this is a picture just from, an earlier period of, I think that to me demonstrates our own history, the Jewish history and migration. Here is a picture from Ukraine today, or maybe earlier this year, where people are having to flee for their lives because, of the war there. So this is something that was put together by Linda Stein, who's a visual artist, and what she did is she creates these boxes where she asks the question, what do you take? What do you take when you have a very short period of time? And we can imagine that because we are dealing with our own climate issues. So what do you take if there's a flood or a fire, or you have to suddenly leave? And so this, if you look on Linda Stein's website, you can see some of her, it's Linda Stein Artist, some of her other imaginations of what people grabbed. And sometimes they're practical things and sometimes they're memories, really. This is actually a current refugee camp with Ukrainian, housing Ukrainians. And so, the refugee camps are very difficult. And just to say, when people get to the United States, most people are put in detention, and there are prisons all over the country that has asylum seekers, and several in Minnesota as well. There are local jails, and there's actually a movement to get them moved out of the jails. And they've committed no crime. The people, they're being held while their hearings are pending, which can be years. This is another artistic response of gathering clothing that somebody took, and a backpack, and, the kind of things that people carry with them. This is just a picture that appeals to me because it's, what people need is friendship, probably the largest thing. And I often talk about my sister who has died, but she was a school teacher and a housewife, and she took on a family. She didn't house them, but she became their kind of welcome committee, I guess. And so she helped them find jobs and learn English. They were from Russia or Moldova. And one of the first people I interviewed was a daughter of that family who came as about a 12-year-old, and she was talked about how much it meant to have my sister's friendship. It was the one safe place that they felt. She felt so uncomfortable and out of place and lost, really, having moved to a new country with a new land. And teenagers can be rough. So this is some pictures of some of the responses of Jewish organizations. You can see down in the corner there, there's a little Hayes symbol. And it's from a synagogue in New York that has set itself up as a sanctuary organization to welcome people, and has an asylum clinic. And this you cannot see very well, but I kind of like it. It says, "We will outlive you." And I think that is the story of Rory in the play. And this is also from New York. It's from the Lower East Side community center that once welcomed Jewish immigrants, and now it's welcoming immigrants from Asia largely, and other places around the world. This is just something I like because, you know, we are one big world, but we forget. This is something from Highest, which has this Refugee Shabbat coming up in February that people can sign up for. So Highest is funny in that the president, the last president of Highest, is from the Twin Cities, and he lives in the Twin Cities now. He's the president emeritus, Robert Aronson. But Highest doesn't actually have a formal presence in Minnesota right now, as it did in years past. And in some cities, there is an organization that is just Highest and a Highest affiliate. So people are connecting kind of in long distance or working with other organizations to bring Jewish values into it. This is Ramon, who really supported us. And this is the image for our play, which was created by an artist named Lauren Darling. And this is a picture of challah bread because it becomes a central symbol in the play of sharing, I guess. And this is a stained glass window from a synagogue community room, but it just represents to me all the different pieces that have to come together, kind of a mosaic of people and personalities and ideas that I think the play represents. And I think there's one more here. Little candles, hope and light. So I think I'll give it back to you, Carolyn.
Okay, thank you. So Cindy talked about Highest. I want to add one thing about Neighborhood House, because I think that excuse me, describes part of the Jewish response. Neighborhood House was founded in 1897 when the women of Mount Zion Synagogue wanted to create a safe haven for Jewish refugees fleeing from persecution in Russia. And it has evolved over time. As Cindy said, the Jewish immigration problem, if you will, is not so great now, but Neighborhood House now serves as a place of welcome for all people in need. Thousands of refugees, immigrants and they run programming and education and help with food and housing. And so this is how our play really does fit in with their mission. I wanted to talk for just a moment, and I'll try to reduce this. I could talk forever, but we want to have time for questions. My work as a freelance director and as a theater professor has always focused on the idea of theater and social change. As Irit said at the beginning, I helped found and then directed an organization called the Women's Theater Project, where we did plays by women about issues important to women. And we tried to employ women in all the aspect of the production of those plays. And in the course of that, we did plays about domestic violence and rape and women and work and nurses and women in religion, pornography, which was a play that Cindy wrote, women's suffrage. And then as I moved into working with other theaters, and at Hamlin, my plays were about the violence of war and racism and white supremacy and LGBT issues. At Hamlin, I founded a social justice theater troupe called Making Waves. And we went, it was interactive, we created interactive theater pieces where, and we went to classes and conferences and meetings and churches and all sorts of places where the students would present a short play about some topic where a problem, and clearly a problem person, maybe somebody made a racist remark or somebody encountered a sexist or anti-LGBT or a transphobic remark. And it was in the scene that they do, the moment was handled really poorly. Then we open it up to questions from the audience where they can ask that, not the characters, but the actors, excuse me, not the actors, but the characters' questions. Like, why did you say that? Or how did you feel when she did that? And the characters respond. And then we invite a volunteer from the audience to come and substitute in for the antagonist. And they start the play again, and then that person interrupts by saying something different. And then we can talk about how that worked, and then maybe somebody else will get up and try one. And it was an immensely effective way of talking about some of these issues. And boy, do I wish we were working at Hamlin now, but that's another story. And I think all of this for me was grounded in a notion that I learned about as a teenager in the youth group at my temple, which was the notion of tikkun olam, our obligation as Jews to repair the world. And that notion has stayed with me really my whole life, about what is it that I can do to help repair the world. And I do volunteer work, and now I work at a food bank, but I most of my life have used the thing I think I do best, which is direct plays. I have used that as my vehicle toward pushing for social change. And I think this play obviously is part of that. Cindy, take it, and then we'll open it up to some questions.
Yeah. Well, I have to first respond to that because I got into playwriting. I have a background as a journalist, and I was also a lawyer. But I thought that theater is the one place where you can offer people an opportunity for transformation. It's a conversation with the audience. You're not even film. You're kind of telling people what to think. In journalism, it's kind of very formulaic in a way when you get right down to it. I worked at KSTP in Minneapolis. But in theater, you have much more opportunity to bring people close to stories and close to people. They're seeing actual people on stage that are embodying the story. And I think it opens up hearts and minds. And then when you open hearts and minds, I think you can bring about change. But one thing that is interesting about Minnesota is it has the highest per capita, or one of the highest per capita, but maybe the highest, refugee resettlement in the country. Now, it doesn't have the highest immigration settlement. There are other states and cities that are higher than that, but in terms of refugees, Minnesota has a very large outreach. And there are many organizations that do that, which are like highly impressive, including Jonathan House, which has transitional housing for some asylum seekers. And that is unusual around the country. I mean, there's hardly any place in any other city that has that. Jonathan House has one in Georgia, I think, as well. And then there's Alight, which used to have another name, but it's an international refugee organization that operates from Minnesota. There's the International Institute of Minnesota, which has volunteer opportunities and does training for immigrants and refugees. And then the Advocates for Human Rights, which I think, is one of the premier legal organizations that represents immigrants, and several other immigration-related organizations that really do great outreach to these populations. And then, Carolyn mentioned Mount Zion Temple. And this came up when we were going to the neighborhood house. And I was like, I think that's familiar. And as I've said, my grandparents are from Minnesota. My mother grew up in Minnesota and went to the University of Minnesota. But there's nobody really in my family alive to fact check things with, or nobody that I can really talk with, that's currently able to recall things. So I said, that sounds really familiar, Mount Zion Temple. So I started looking it up, and then Carolyn said, well, they were German Jews. And I was like, well, my grandmother was a German Jew, Grandma Tilly, and she lived with us for a period of time. So I started looking up, and sure enough, my great-grandparents were like one of the founding members of Mount Zion Temple and are actually buried in their cemetery in like plots, A and B, like in the first. So it was kind of just nice circling back for me on this topic in ways that, like, I didn't know I was going to be doing genealogical research while I was writing it, but there I was. So the one other thing I wanted to say is, even though, two other things, I guess, I tried to focus on some of the people that you hear less about. In the news, you get sort of quick snippets about certain populations, but the stories I wanted to tell were mostly different kinds of people. So one of them is a woman who from South America who's uncovered corruption on her job and has had to flee because suddenly there's death threats and there's weird, calls to her mother, and so those people can't stay because their lives are in danger. And then another is this lesbian from Russia. And there's actually an organization of LGBT Russian asylum seekers, I guess, and refugees, because so many have had to leave since Putin, a law was put into place. It's called the propaganda law, but what it did is basically, we can see the effects here now, similar things. It unleashed an anti-gay vigilante response. And what happens is people will get attacked on the streets. Like there's one guy here, I know, he got attacked on the subway, the metro, and he went to the police, and the police basically just laughed at him. So that's a circumstance when asylum comes into play. It's not just a persecution, but it's persecution that is not the government doesn't respond to it in some way or another. So if it's just you're having a fight with a neighbor, you probably don't qualify for asylum. But if it's a systemic problem and the government refuses to address it, so that could be religious, or the government is perpetrating it, like if it's religious persecution, or that's when asylum comes into play. And then one other thing that I sort of knew, but in researching the play, I became more aware of, is there's a huge gap. There are a lot of people who want to help and want to volunteer in big ways and little ways, whether it's sending clothing or a few dollars, or, right now in New York, we're having a huge issue with the people that are being bused here from the southern border. And, so people have stepped up to do lots of different things. But in most cases, there's those people that want to help, and then there are people who need help, but there's a gap in between. And connecting is really, really difficult. So the people, I've had people say to me, I want to host somebody. How do I go about doing it? It's not that easy to do. You have to find the right people. You have to apply. You have to go through paperwork. Some people do it informally, which is nice and great. And I met many of them. But it's an area where people actually have to, if they want to help, they actually have to go out and find a way to do it. So it's a curious thing. Like, for example, and one more example is there are people in prisons, even in Minnesota, who are being held there for asylum hearings, but there's no list of them. And the way that people find out who they are, there's an organization in Minnesota, it's an informal group, and they go to the prisons and they visit people. And you kind of have to have somebody's name or have an invitation to even visit somebody in jail, the way the jails are set up in the US. they go and visit people, and then while they're there, they try and collect names of other people. And then when they get their names, they start corresponding with them and trying to find out what they need, if they need translating help, if they need help with documents, if they, maybe some people want a Bible or a book, and try and set up some sort of way to reach out. So I do have one situation in the play where a woman is put into detention, and there's a volunteer who comes and finds out who she is and what her needs, and finds a family who will host her. And that is, when the systems are so bad, the ways that people are stepping up individually is what inspires me. And what I hope the play inspires. So I think, if there are any questions or comments, Joe Lane made a comment in the chat. I would love for him to.
Sure, I can share that, Cindy, if you'd like.
Sure.
Both sides of my family, both paternal and maternal, came from Eastern Europe. My paternal side from Lithuania, at the level of my grandparents, and my maternal side from Romania and Ukraine. But you told a story about your grandfather who got out of Russia in a wheelbarrow. The story that I've heard from both my grandmother and my mother and my aunt was that my grandfather, who I'm named after, at 14 years old, had extremely good carpentry skills. This was in the late 1890s, early 1900s in Ukraine, and was about to be conscripted into the Tsar's army. And my great-grandparents dressed him up as a girl, put him in the back of a wagon, and rode him across whatever the border is from Ukraine into a different country. And he eventually managed to get to Portugal and immigrate to this country, to New York, where he started a furniture company called Reliable Furniture and became very successful. But several years later, he sent money back, and I think went back himself to bring some of his family members to this country. So my whole family grew up in New York as family of immigrants from Eastern Europe. So your story triggered that.
That's an amazing story. Yeah.
I believe it was a little easier, more welcoming at Ellis Island in those days.
Absolutely.
Than it is at any of our borders today. I mean, you did not have to know someone necessarily, although it probably helped. You didn't have to have a lot of proof that you have to have today. So I feel very lucky.
Yeah, that is one thing.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say that's one thing that has changed is the amount of paperwork that people have to have, there's a book, like for an asylum seeker, it's literally a book, and they have to show, how the country, they have to prove why they should be allowed to stay and why they've been a victim of persecution. So it might be newspaper articles, or this fellow that I was talking about from Russia actually was a lawyer in Russia, the one who was attacked on the subway there. And so he just gathered everything he could. He knew enough to gather stuff before he left, but you have to have your birth certificate, your marriage certificate, a huge amount of documentation that our parents, the grandparents, were able to kind of elude, but the immigration laws have changed so many times over the years. And if anybody's watched Ken Burns, a show on PBS, you get a sense of that, like when people were turned away during World War II. But you were going to say something, Carol.
Oh, yeah. I think the other reality, unfortunately, is that when our families came, they were white. And the great majority of people down at the border are not white, and that the underlying racism in this country makes that even more difficult. The immigration laws are set up very harshly, but I think, and there are white people seeking asylum. I don't want to belittle that, but when you think about the percentages, most of them are not.
There's another difference too. A lot of the Jewish population emigrated, and they were brought in by families. I mean, somebody is here, like you said, Joe. And the Somali population is a bit like that too. People come and they stay with family, or they know family. Other populations are coming in without that support. And that's one of the changes in the system of refugees over the past years. I mean, they're just people who've had to flee. If you're from Ukraine, you might not have a relative anywhere. And that's also particularly true of the gay and lesbian population. Generally, people are resettled or resettle themselves with people from their country. But a lot of the gay and lesbian population, and I'll just use Uganda as an example for this, because I'm familiar with it, people who are rejected by not only their government and their society, but their families. So they can't be resettled with their families. They're resettled with in a community that is welcoming. So it might be San Francisco or someplace like that. And what is also happening now with with the advent of Ukrainian and Afghan refugees, is that model that was used for gay and lesbian populations, which was to set up a welcoming circle of people. So it might be 10 people in a community, and one takes them to the doctor, and one sits with him when he's crying, and one helps get the paperwork together. That is happening now again, and HIAS is one of the groups that's pioneering this, of setting up welcoming circles, so that it's a group of people and that have come together to host a single asylum seeker or asylum family, and kind of spread the enormous amount of adjustment that they have to do, spread that among several people. And there are some groups in Minnesota that are doing that as well now.
One of the things that I can piggyback on, when Cindy told you that list of agencies that are here in Minnesota that are helping, when I think about theater and social change, one of my goals is to not just inform you or educate you about a problem and get you talking about it and asking questions, but also maybe move you to do something. And so we're going to have brochures from those places, and how to contact the Advocates for Human Rights or the Center for the Victims of Torture. Where there are so many places in the Twin Cities that are really pioneering and not pioneering exactly, but leading the way right now in working with asylum seekers. And if a couple of people walk out of the play and take an action, a small action that helps one person, I would feel really good.
Well, we also have talkbacks with several of these people. So among the people, we have our two people from Jonathan House, one who runs it now, and one woman who founded it. And then Alan Silver from Temple Israel is going to talk about their, he ran the Immigration Justice Committee, but they decided to become a sanctuary community, which means they take in an actual family. And he talks about the process of investigating it and what they learned before they set it up. They wanted to find out what was involved. And then we have Robin Phillips from the Advocates for Human Rights, the executive director of that, which is an amazing organization. And Bo Tao Arabe from the founder of the Coalition of Asian American Leaders, CALM, I think it's called, in Minnesota, and was the executive director up until earlier this year. But it's a Hmong woman who came as a child refugee. And we actually tell, most of the stories are composites of various people, but but her story was too good. So I just asked if we could just use her story. So we actually have a character named Bo, who is played by Hmong actor Pashua Bang. And then we have the director of Neighborhood House is going to speak, and then Beth Gendler from Jewish Community Action. Right? Is that the name of the group? Because when we met, we interviewed her when we were there, which was with the National Jewish Women's Association at the time.
National Council of Jewish Women.
Yeah, but she had her own story about a family member in kinder transport. That's the main thing I remember.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we have like 5 more minutes. Is there anybody else that would care to share their experience or to ask a question? Well, I'll keep talking for a minute. I'll just say because my father actually came from Lithuania as well, and he was a child when they came. And I will say that he never told us as kids. He kind of lied his entire life and said he was born in the U.S. And then my oldest brother had to register for the draft. And if you look at all our birth certificates, it said my father was from the U.S. in Pennsylvania, where he grew up. My brother had to register for the draft. Somehow my father decided to tell us he was born in Lithuania. And then in my parents' papers, I see he had no birth certificate. So I believe it was my mother spent, looks like years, trying to get some kind of documentation for him so that he could get a passport because he had no documentation. And I asked my older cousins, for information about why they left Lithuania and if they ever talked about it. And they never talked about it, she said. And she spoke Yiddish with my grandmother who came with it. And but she said the only story she heard was that a house was burned on the next block, and that my grandmother repeated that several times. So I think it was not an accidental fire. It was a house that was set on fire, and they decided they had to leave. But my family grew up in a generation where everybody wanted to assimilate, and they didn't talk about, I think it took roots for people to start talking about their genealogy and family history.
Right. And all of this has led Cindy to the title of the play, I Was a Stranger Too, because I think that speaks to the notion of how close we all are to a generation, and maybe not all of you were born in this country, but how close those of us who were born in this country are to generations of people who had to flee some kind of terrible persecution, going, as Cindy said, all the way back to slavery in Egypt.
And 2 exceptions. Reed has
go ahead.
Well, no. Just the Native American right. population, of course, was here, and much of the African population did come here. They were forced to come here, and so their journeys are somewhat different. And I try to recognize that and acknowledge that.
I was talking about the people on this.
I know. Well, I don't know who's on the call.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Connie, yeah.
Yeah. And Cindy, I just want to say it's Connie Ford. We have a 45-year-old.
Oh, yes.
And haven't seen each other, which is odd, but this has been so helpful. I'm seeing the play in a couple weeks and just wondering whether the recording is going to be available. Is it in 1 week? Wherever we are, I'm seeing it.
As the director, I know it's only 1 week.
Okay, it's in 1 week. So is the recording going to be available?
The recording of this Zoom or a recording of the play?
Of this Zoom.
That's a question for Irit.
We will try to make it available. The last couple of times that we recorded, we were not successful in retrieving it. So I don't know if there's something wrong with our account, but we will, I will work with our people to see if we can do it. And if we can, I will send out an email, a link to Cindy and Carolyn.
Okay.
And then Connie, if you want to send me your email address, I can certainly send it to you also. That's assuming we can get it to work. So
And
what we
I-
can do is we can post it on our YouTube page, and so it will be accessible.
And I put in the chat our website for the play. And if you go there, you can order tickets. So please do, or tell your friends or your neighbors, anybody.
It sounds like an amazing play, and I think people would benefit from seeing it. I think we all have stories to tell from our families and neighbors and people we know. My parents were Holocaust survivors, so I totally can relate to all this. And the news these days is very disturbing about what is happening to people in different states in the United States that are trying to seek asylum. So I think it's wonderful that you are bringing this to light and making everybody open their eyes and remember what is happening in the world. It's so easy to put your head in the sand and not pay attention. So thank you for what you are doing. It's really amazing. And thank you so much for speaking today. It was just a pleasure to hear about it. And thank you everybody for joining us. We hope to do more TC Talks in the future. Now that we're in 2023, we'll send out more information on those as they come up. But Cindy and Carolyn, thank you so much for taking the time and for being here. And we just so appreciate what you are doing and what you have done for us today. And good luck with the show. I hope that everything goes well. And I should say break a leg. And I hope you get really full audiences. I know it's a large theater. And I hope that people come out and support you because it's just wonderful. And are you hoping to do the show again in the future? Who knows, huh?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
We're counting on audiences to take it around the country.
Wow, wow, that would be amazing. Well, please keep us posted about.
And thank you so much for inviting us to do this. I really appreciate that.
Oh my
Yeah.
gosh, we're so appreciative that you were able to do this. So thank you, and everybody who was on the call, please spread the word and encourage people to come see the show.
Yes.
I think they will not be sorry. So thank you, everybody. And
Thank you.
let's hope the weather
Thank
stays
you.
wonderful for Cindy coming in town and for the show, because that always helps. So far, it's looking really good. So
Yeah, no
Great.
snow, please.
no snow. Yes, yes. Let's put it out there in the universe.
Right,
Anyway, go
and
ahead,
no
Carolyn.
COVID in the cast, right?
Yes, 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 yes. You know, I know theaters are taking many precautions these days to keep their casts healthy. So
Yeah, you have to wear a mask if you come to the play.
oh, that's great. That's great. I think that will make people feel more comfortable and more comfortable attending. So thank you so much. Have a great day, and everybody take care.
Great. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.